Good evening, good afternoon, whenever you're taking the opportunity to view this. We are grateful for you tuning in and being a part of our Journey into Acts series. We want to continue that. Acts chapter 10 this evening. Acts chapter 10. We looked at Acts chapter 9 yesterday, and we looked at sort of the influence of Barnabas, and we looked at some of the things that happened when Paul, Saul of Tarsus, went to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 10, we have a different character, but a somewhat similar story in so much as it's a person going into an uncomfortable situation and how they realized what they needed to do, and they had some help. And that's Peter. And Peter goes to speak to some Gentiles. And this is a very uncomfortable moment for Peter because Peter has been raised, Peter has been taught, Peter has been trained to preach his message in a certain group, in a certain audience, in a certain environment. For Paul, it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, for him to make connections with the early church leaders, for him to make amends, maybe even in a slight way, for some of the things that he had said and done previously. It was important for Paul when he went to Jerusalem to have a man like Barnabas stand beside him and vouch for him to the church. For Peter, it's a little bit different. Again, some similarities, but obviously some differences as well. For Peter, it's different. Peter is going into a situation that he's very uncomfortable with. And he really doesn't have a Barnabas to stand next to him, but he's going to gain that person, even though that person is not like him, even though that person was not raised like him, even though that person is not the same as him. It's just an interesting story, an interesting dynamic to have these stories back to back. Saul of Tarsus goes into Jerusalem, a former persecutor of the church, now gospel preacher, aided by someone who is a Christian like Barnabas, who helps sort of support him in this early endeavor. And now you have Peter who's going to go, and it says there in Acts chapter 10 that he's going to go to a man named Cornelius, who's in Caesarea. And the Bible tells us that Cornelius is a wonderful man, a devout man who feared God with all of his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. So this is not someone who necessarily doesn't believe. It's not someone who has no connection to the faith, but it is someone who is not like Peter. So when Peter gets the message to go and teach, to go and preach, to go and encourage, his immediate response is, I can't do that. It's in the course of seeing a vision. God shows him this vision, and if you remember, in verse 15, the voice came out in his vision that what God has made clean, do not call common. It happened 3 times. Verse 17 tells us, while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, the men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate, called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. While Peter was pondering the vision, this is verse 19 of Acts chapter 10, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them. Peter went down to the man and said, I am the one you're looking for. What's the reason for your coming? And really to sort of sum up, that they explain that Cornelius needed to be trained, needed to be taught, and he was told. If you go all the way back to verse 3, he was told in a vision, Cornelius was, by an angel, that there will be one who will come and teach you. His name is Simon, and he is called Peter. He is lodging with a tanner whose house is by the sea. And now we see that sort of acted out. But I want you to pay attention now to verse 30. As Cornelius recounts this experience to Peter, Peter has shown up at his door. Cornelius falls at his feet. Peter says, stand up. I'm just like you. I'm a man. Which should have been the first indication that Peter's kind of having maybe a different thought, a change in mindset. Cornelius tells him what happened. In verse 33, Cornelius says, I sent for you at once. You have been kind enough to come. Now, therefore, we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. I don't know when exactly it happened for Peter, but at some point, as Peter comes to Cornelius and they have this conversation, the light bulb goes off in Peter's head. This is what the vision was about. It wasn't about animals per se. It wasn't about the old law necessarily, but it was about that God now has opened the door for all who will come. And for someone like Peter, who is so concerned and so consumed, maybe is even a better word, with preaching the gospel message. Now, we could go back and we could psychoanalyze Peter. We could say that maybe he's doing this because he denied Jesus and he felt like he was trying to make amends or fix some of the things that had gone wrong while he was an apostle. We could psychoanalyze this, but the bottom line is we know who Peter is. Peter is a preacher. Peter is an apostle. He is one who is desiring to bring others to know Jesus. And you go all the way back to our first introduction to Simon Peter. It is when his brother Andrew comes and says, I want you to come and see. We found the one that we've been waiting for. And ever since that moment, Peter has really honestly not left the side of Jesus. In John 21, there is that moment where Peter says, I'm going fishing, because honestly, he doesn't really know what else to do at that point. But then when he sees Jesus and they have that moment sitting there at breakfast on the shoreline and he's given that charge, Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Tend after my lambs or feed my sheep. He takes that seriously. Acts tells us, you begin in Acts chapter 1 and of course in Acts chapter 2 that we're most familiar with, he does not hesitate to preach the gospel. And in this moment, I don't know when, like I said, I don't know when it happened in the conversation, but as Peter is drawing near to the house perhaps, maybe as Peter is talking to those men who had brought him to Cornelius, at some point the light bulb goes off and Peter realizes this isn't about animals and this isn't about eating meat. This is about God opened the door and I now have the responsibility to keep that door open. So in verse 34, you have that phrase that we've oftentimes referred to. Truly, I understand. I think we read over it sometimes. We don't pay attention to that being how Peter acknowledges this. Truly, I understand that God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. It is absolutely vital to your understanding and to my understanding of the Apostle Peter to know that this was very difficult for him. This was not an easy comment for him to make. However, it was a necessary comment for his ministry, for his moving forward as an apostle, as a preacher, as a Christian. For him to look at Cornelius and say, I truly, I understand that God is no respecter of persons, and that those that fear him and do what is right, they are acceptable. Now, here's the application point for our devotional time today. It's very easy sometimes for us to unintentionally, but still nonetheless it happens, unintentionally we will look at people and we will say, you know, I'm glad they don't go to church with me. And we may not even say that out loud, but that's what goes through our mind, because they don't look like us, they don't sound like us, they don't talk like us, they don't struggle with the same things we struggle with, and the list goes on and on and on. But we, like Simon Peter, have to come to that realization. I truly understand. I don't just say it, I understand it. I grasp it, I hold on to it, I value it. I know that God is no respecter of persons. And wherever the gospel message is presented, wherever it is found, those that fear God and do what he says, do what's right, they are acceptable to him. It's a powerful message for all of us to keep considering. Not just to consider once, but to keep considering each and every day of our lives. That in so doing, we are doing the will of God by understanding, truly understanding, God is no respecter of persons. I hope this encourages you. Maybe it challenges you in your thinking or the way that you've treated people. And maybe perhaps there's something that you need to do to sort of correct that behavior. And I hope that this encourages you to do that. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow night here at the building at 6:30 for our time of midweek Bible study. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.